Welcome to the 12th and the final talk of the year-long lecture series that we've dedicated to celebrate UTSA's 50th anniversary. I've had the pleasure of going to a few of these and I've really enjoyed hearing what some of our fantastic faculty have been working on and how they connect with the community and how San Antonio is so intertwined with what's happening at UTSA. It's really exciting. I'd like to take just a moment to thank, I think they just left the room unless they stopped to get something to eat, the UTSA String Quartet. I think they were just lovely. And just so you know, we had Alejandro Pedro Fuentes, Adam Garza, Dathan Elizondo, and Mariah Ramirez. So they were just wonderful. Also, thank you to the Tobin Center for hosting us this evening. This is my first time in this room at the Tobin Center, so I think this is absolutely delightful, and I'm really grateful to UTSA staff for helping us to put this together as well. Now, it's my pleasure as the interim dean of the College of Architecture, Construction, and Planning to introduce the keynote speaker for this evening, Mr. Ian Caine. Ian Caine is an associate professor of architecture and director of the UTSA Center for Urban and Regional Planning Research. A registered architect, he holds an S.Marc.S. degree in architecture and urbanism from MIT. He also earned a BA in political science and an MArch from the Washington University, where he received the AIA School Medal and Certificate of Merit. Ian is a dedicated educator, and I've gotten to know that in the few months that I've been able to spend with him in the college. He's received the 2017 ACSA AIAS New Faculty Teaching Award and the 2017 UT Region's Outstanding Teaching Award, which is very distinguished across Texas, an award. He's also received the 2016 UTSA President's Distinguished Teaching Award and the 2017 CACP Outstanding Teaching Award, as well as selected for the Architecture 2030 Pilot Curriculum Project, which highlighted a curriculum developed by Dr. Rahman Azari as one of 7 nationwide that transformed the culture of sustainable design education. In 2018, he was a visiting faculty in urban design at Washington University. Now, Ian's research explores the form, processes, and impacts of metropolitan and mega-regional expansion. The work has appeared in multiple venues, including La News, Scenario, Housing Studies, Sustainability, the Architect's Newspaper. I could go on, but he's also received coverage in popular press outlets, including the Discovery Channel, the New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, Metropolitan POV, and Texas Public Radio. So you may have heard some of his work here in town. He's also a researcher at the Spatial History Project at Stanford University, where he is leading an effort to create an interactive timeline of suburban expansion for San Antonio. His urban designs with colleague Derek Hoferlin received an honorable mention in the Drive Features competition, which was selected as a finalist in the Build a Better Burg competition, and were awarded one of 6 winning entries in the Rising Tides competition. I think you get the idea. Ian is well decorated, well appreciated by the teaching faculty at UTSA, and I think you're really going to enjoy his presentation tonight. So could you please help me welcome Ian Caine.
Well, thank you, Dr. Browning, and thank you to UTSA for putting together this fantastic series. I've been able to attend a number of them and I've really enjoyed them. But I think these types of community events are very rewarding, so I hope that we can continue this tradition. Okay, so what would a sustainable San Antonio look like? It's a big question, so I put it in big letters. That's 124-point font. It's a big question for me personally because as an architect who studies cities, I know that if we want to minimize the worst effects of global warming, the most important thing that we can do is to fix the city. And so when it comes to climate change, cities like San Antonio are both the problem and a solution. They're the problem because even though cities cover less than 2% of the Earth's surface, they produce 60% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So that's pretty scary. But the good news is that cities are also the solution to the climate crisis. And I say that because, simply put, cities are where virtually all of the growth and change in societies take place. After all, it's cities, not nation states, that are the fundamental unit of the global economy. Since 2008, more than half of the world's population has lived in a city, and this trend is only accelerating. So let me give you a few numbers. 200,000 people move to a city every single day. Hard to believe. That means that 4,200 people will move to a city during this talk. Rapid growth and change in cities offers us a unique opportunity because it means that if we can figure out how to make cities sustainable, that we can solve the climate crisis in a generation. So I've come here tonight with an important message. To save our planet, we need to fix our cities. So that's why for the next few minutes, I'd like to share with you some ideas that I have about how to fix San Antonio. Now, I come to this as a relative outsider. I've only lived in San Antonio for a short 8 years. So I think this probably hurts and helps my perspective. It means that I have less local knowledge and lived experience in the city than many people in this room. Still, I have a fresh set of eyes, and sometimes a fresh set of eyes can see new things. Okay, so back to this big question. What would a sustainable San Antonio look like? And like any big question, it helps to break it down into smaller parts. So I'm going to try that. Let's start at the end of the question and work backwards. What would a sustainable San Antonio look like? Now that's difficult for an architect like me to answer because for us the question of what something looks like, which we call form, is never so simple. For an architect, what something looks like is a spatial expression of values. So tonight I want to talk about values. And I want to share with you a set of values that I think would make San Antonio sustainable. Next I want to talk about this word sustainable. What does that mean, especially as it relates to San Antonio? If we just took the United Nations definition, we'd say that a sustainable San Antonio would commit itself to the long-term maintenance of social and environmental and economic systems. And so for the purposes of this discussion, I'll use these 3 value categories to share my own vision about a sustainable San Antonio. And I'll start with social values, which brings to mind 3 important concepts, and that's geography and equity and history. So let's start with social geography. A sustainable San Antonio will recognize that the center is no longer the center and the edge is no longer the edge. Now this first value speculates that the most sustainable location for San Antonio's impending growth, in other words, where are we going to add 1.1 million people in 25 years?
Really?
That's a good question, right? Should we try to put them all downtown, as close to the center as possible? Or should we scatter them throughout the suburbs? It's not clear. Now for the first half of San Antonio's 300-year history, it was clearly more sustainable to live downtown. That's because that's where the businesses were, that's where the markets were, that's where the houses were. But about 150 years ago, this pattern turned dramatically. That's when people, especially people with money, decided that cities themselves were simply not sustainable places to live. And it's easy to understand why. At the time, cities were polluted, they were overcrowded, they had virtually no civil infrastructure. So it's about this time that people with means began to leave the central city. And this began a massive and sustained wave of suburbanization. It started with streetcar suburbs like Alamo Heights, it rolled into post-war suburbs like Balcones Heights, and it continues today in contemporary suburbs like, say, Stone Oak. And you can read this history in the data, because a few years ago, a colleague and I mapped the location of every single construction completion in San Antonio over the last 120 years. So that was over 600,000 buildings. And we found that when it comes to large-scale growth, the city only grows from center to edge, and it never grows from edge to center. So to show you what I mean, during the decade of the 1950s, which you see there, the peak zone of development was 6 miles from Main Plaza, which is the center of the historical city. That's where most of the construction was taking place. During the 1960s, the peak zone of construction expanded to 9 miles from center. And this outward pattern of growth continued uninterrupted through the first decade of the 21st century, when the peak zone of construction measured a full 16 miles from the center of Main Plaza. So to summarize, for most of our city's history, people with financial means have gravitated towards the edge of the city. And they did it because they considered that the edge was more sustainable. It sustained their health, it sustained their finances, and it sustained their social networks. Okay, now this is where it gets interesting. Because if you ask most architects and planners like me and my colleagues, they'll tell you that a sustainable San Antonio is all about a return to the center. That a return to the center represents the most ecologically and financial and sustainable arrangement. And while I'm sympathetic to this argument, I struggle with it because it flies in the face of all of the historical data that I have about how cities grow. It also struggles to address the many negative impacts of gentrification, which is what happens when people with money decide to move back to the city. Now, our city's comprehensive plan is fairly diplomatic in this regard. It predicts that there will be 13 major development nodes that will be spread throughout the city, and that these nodes will absorb the majority of our growth. And I think that makes sense to me. I think it's a good plan. But here's my larger concern, that if you listen to most architects and planners talk, you would think that the future of the city is being won or lost downtown. But the data indicates that the vast majority of the growth and change in our city continues to take place at the edge, as it always has. So in my mind, a sustainable San Antonio will enthusiastically embrace its polycentric future. It will direct its best design and planning resources to where the growth is, and that's the edge. And it remembers that at least when it comes to growth, the edge is the center. Okay, now, the relationship between the edge and the center is also an interesting way to frame a discussion about equity, because a sustainable San Antonio will be an equitable San Antonio. Now, one concept that helps me understand equity comes from Bell Hooks, the African-American feminist scholar. And she writes that an equitable society must evolve from margin to center, and that societies, by marginalizing large groups of people, actually do damage to the entire society, including those who hold power. As an architect, this reminds me to prioritize the voices of communities that my own profession, along with planners and policymakers, have historically excluded from decision making. It reminds me that a sustainable San Antonio will transform itself from the margin to the center. Now, there are physical and socioeconomic margins all over our city. We don't always recognize them because many times they're invisible. But they come in the form of zoning restrictions and school districts and federal support for home loans and decisions about where to put highways and TIF districts. This is Culebra Road, and it represents one such margin. Now, this margin comes in the form of redlining. Now, remember that redlining was a systematic denial of financial resources like mortgages and insurance to people based on race and based on ethnicity. It was legal in the United States until 1977. And the practice led to massive financial disinvestment in communities, mostly Black and Latino communities. Okay, but what does this have to do with sustainability? Well, the form of the city is no accident. It represents the values of the people who build it. So if you accept Bell Hooks' argument that the only way that a society can transform itself is to incorporate the experiences of the people who live at the margins, then it becomes critical for us, people who occupy the center, to look outside of our experience in order to achieve transformation. And so the sustainable San Antonio will transform itself from the margin to the center. Okay, number 3, I want to talk about history. A sustainable San Antonio will remember that history is not only something to preserve, but also something to inhabit and something to extend. Because when you think about cities, remember that they're living, breathing, dynamic organisms. They change every day, they change every hour, they change every minute. And they do so in response to shifting technology, shifting politics, and shifting culture. For this reason, historic preservation is best understood as a critical attempt to balance continuity and change in the built environment. So to illustrate these dynamics, let's consider the life of a hypothetical street corner in San Antonio over the course of 200 years. Okay, so pretend like it's the year 1880. This is our hypothetical piece of land in what is about to become a hypothetical inner ring suburb. In 1885, the streets are platted and a streetcar is installed. By the year 1905, 5 new homes are constructed. By 1925, automobiles have become commonplace for middle-class families in the United States. So the streetcar is removed and replaced with a median. Garages and driveways are added behind some of the homes. 1955, 2 more homes are built on the corner lots. Both of them have garages, by the way. They both have driveways that connect to the increasingly busy street. In 1975, there was a recession. So the residents begin to subdivide the initial homes, turn them into rental apartments. It's happened all over cities in the United States. 2020, the median is removed and it's replaced with bike lanes. In 2040, rideshare and micro-mobility make individual cars obsolete.
Yes.
Driveways disappear and are replaced with accessory dwelling units, tiny homes. For homeowners, this helps offset San Antonio's skyrocketing property taxes.
No.
By 2050, there are virtually no individual cars on the road, so the city offers to sell the right-of-way to any developer who agrees to build affordable housing. They sell it to them for $1.
No. Trees, please. Trees, yes.
By 2080, our hypothetical street corner has undergone a complete transformation. Some of the changes made it better, some may have made it worse, but they all reflected people's attempts to respond to the challenges of their time and of their place. In this regard, I'd argue that change generally makes cities more environmentally and culturally sustainable, not less. So a sustainable San Antonio will accept that history is not only something to preserve, it's a physical and cultural framework that will allow us to accommodate 1.1 million additional people in the next 25 years without losing track of who we are and who we would like to become. Okay. Let's move on to environmental values. This will allow us to introduce 3 more critical concepts, and that's mobility, energy, and water. First, let's talk about mobility. A sustainable San Antonio will reimagine mobility as a multifunctional system. Now, I'd like to start this one out with a picture of a traffic jam. This is downtown Chicago in 1909. Don't ever complain about I-10 again. I love pictures of traffic jams from this time period because we were in the midst of a triple transportation revolution. Within the course of 40 years, we had moved from the horse-drawn carriage to the electric streetcar and to the automobile. So that's a tremendous amount of change for a society to absorb in just a few short decades. Now this picture reveals the stress that it put on streets. Notice that there's no stoplights in this picture. We didn't really start using stoplights until around 1920s. So it's a mess. Now, how did modern architects, planners, and engineers respond to the mess that was the 19th century city? This is a famous 1926 modern planning proposal for Berlin. Notice how the reimagined street separates the functions of the cities into discrete elements. So pedestrians never interact with automobiles. Automobiles never interact with trains, for example. In theory, it was a highly rational approach to transportation planning. And it made a lot of sense, but of course, 100 years later, we know how this turned out. That the city devolved into an exercise in highway engineering, which prioritizes the movement of the automobile at any and all costs.
Yeah.
So this is an image of the Broadway Street corridor. You all know that there's been a lot of disagreement there recently about the wisdom of adding protected bike lanes. But these types of arguments are breaking out all over the city. And as we seek to redefine the relationships between cars and bicyclists, between pedestrians and scooters. When I read the local headlines today, and I took these just from the last few months, I feel like I'm back in that traffic jam in downtown Chicago in 1909. We're experiencing a rapid shift in transportation technology. Our move to autonomous vehicles and shared mobility and micro-mobility is challenging us. We also understand that our current transportation networks are no longer sustainable. That's because they support automobiles, but they devalue pedestrians and bicyclists and public transit. So a sustainable San Antonio will seize the day to design a multifunctional transportation network while avoiding the queer mistakes of the past 100 years. Okay, let's talk about energy. A sustainable San Antonio will decentralize and localize energy production. This one is about the ability of new technologies to decentralize the production of electrical power, but it's also about the ability of new technologies to decentralize political power. Now, these plants require enormous capital investment, so it made a lot of sense for large utilities to finance and build and operate the plants. And it produced a highly centralized situation, as utility companies own the power plants and the transmission lines, and the substations and the distribution lines, and they even own the electrical meter on your house. Now, from an environmental perspective, centralized production of energy via fossil fuels was an unmitigated disaster. It brought our climate to the edge of ruin. But what about from a policy perspective? Can you still hear me? Okay. From a policy perspective, today we stand at a technological and a policy crossroads. The logic of wind and solar and water power is very different than the logic of coal and nuclear and natural gas. Renewable energy is fundamentally decentralized, so it's free and available to anybody with the ability to capture and store energy. So that means that renewable energy is virtually impossible to monopolize. It also means that in the future, energy generation will be possible at multiple scales. So at the scale of the individual who needs just some power for their own use. It works at the scale of the building, like a net zero building that consumes no energy and actually produces a surplus that it can sell back to the grid. And it works even at the scale of the large centralized plant. So in this diverse future, the electrical grid becomes a piece of public infrastructure. It's owned and managed for the benefit of everybody who wants to buy or sell energy. So in this regard, it's much like a road network or like the internet. Now, there are a number of names for this concept. Some call it energy democracy. It's been called the third industrial revolution. But as San Antonio continues to move from fossil fuels to renewables, it can do more than just mitigate the climate crisis. When San Antonio is sustainable, it will double down on its locally owned energy network, making sure that it supports a distributed energy production model that works for everybody. Okay, water. A sustainable San Antonio will track each water drop throughout the entire hydrologic cycle. Now, you probably remember this diagram from school. It describes how a drop of water moves through the Earth's atmosphere. And the water cycle, as you remember, has no beginning and it has no end. But what's important for our purposes is that the introduction of cities into this cycle can have huge impacts. And some of these impacts are very negative. For example, when we build a lot of roofs and a lot of parking lots, we introduce impermeable surfaces that magnify flooding. They increase runoff. They deposit pollutants into our aquifer. And these types of problems are very well known to us here in San Antonio. But still, they're very difficult to combat. And one of the reasons involves the complexity of the water cycle. So consider for a moment a day in the life of a Bexar County water drop. It's not a simple life, because that water drop moves across roofs and gutters and parking lots and hills and rivers and lakes. It moves through unincorporated areas and cities. It encounters multiple regulatory agencies at the federal, state, and local levels. That water drop is touched by architects and activists and bankers and civil engineers and home builders and homeowners associations. So it isn't hard to understand then why we have difficulty working with water. But what's amazing actually is just how much success that we do have. So take an issue, for example, like urban development over the recharge zone. This activity is problematic because it pollutes our water system. It's also hard to confront because it cuts across multiple political and financial and regulatory boundaries. Still, our Edwards Aquifer Protection Program has successfully safeguarded 160,000 acres of land over the recharge zone.
Yes, congratulations.
Yes, congratulations. A sustainable San Antonio will multiply these types of efforts, which recognize the systemic nature of water and the need for holistic solutions. Okay. Now, the last set of values I want to talk about tonight are economic values. And this will give us a chance to discuss three final concepts. That's cost and housing and data. So I want to start with cost. A sustainable San Antonio will begin to calculate and assign the real cost of the city. Now, I'm talking about the entire city. I'm talking about buildings and roads and bridges and railways and utilities. How do we measure the cost of these items? And who pays for them? So let's consider a simple example. Let's take a brand new house. Let's say that a developer pays $225,000 to build that house, to build that street, and build that storm sewer. And then they turn around and sell the house to the first buyer for $300,000. So the developer pockets $75,000. Good for them. Now, this is how we typically assign cost and benefit in the city. It's a very limited market equation, and it largely measures initial cost, and it largely measures land value. That's it. But the difficulty here is that this little house has environmental and social costs that aren't reflected in this market equation. There's a process called life cycle analysis. Some of my colleagues in our school work with it carefully. And it assesses the environmental cost of buildings across all stages of their lives. Now, life cycle analysis reveals that the actual cost of construction of a building represents just a small percentage of its real cost. That's because our current real estate markets don't account for the real cost of things like resource extraction and greenhouse gas emissions and groundwater pollution and landfill. Real estate markets also don't account for things like increased traffic that development brings, or the negative health impacts of some forms of urban development. But those are real costs, and somebody has to pay for them. Now, the larger implication here is that much of the real cost of buildings and cities is paid for by society at large, while the benefits accrue to the people who build and consume the city. So these invisible cost transfers take place every time that we build a building, every time we construct a highway, and every time that we extend a storm sewer. So Sustainable San Antonio will find a way to calculate the full life cycle costs of its buildings and of the city. It will allow us to make more informed and transparent choices about how and where we want to expend our resources and to better decide who should pay for them. Okay, let's talk about housing, one of my favorite topics. A Sustainable San Antonio will stop investing in single-family housing as a way to build shelter and personal growth. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Think with me. First, understand that San Antonio has more single-family houses relative to population than almost any city in the United States. There's the numbers. About 65% of our housing units reside in a single-family detached home. Here's a chart of 100 typical housing units in San Antonio. 63 of them, or 65 of them reside in a single-family home. Those are the green ones on this chart. The other colors down there at the bottom right represent the other smattering of multifamily housing types. Duplexes, quads, apartment buildings, things like that. So if you want to live in something other than a single-family home, your options are pretty limited in San Antonio. Now, this is not an accident. There's some reasons for this. First of all, there's all kinds of financial and regulatory support for single-family housing at both the local and federal levels. So at the local level, most of San Antonio, outside of the historic core, is zoned for single-family. At the federal level, the U.S. government will invest almost $600 billion in the next 10 years in home mortgage interest deductions. Because rightly or wrongly, we have decided that home ownership is a great way to house people and a great way to build personal wealth. So we're both zoning for and subsidizing single-family houses. And you might say, well, so what? I like my single-family home. I like my tax deduction. Thank you very much. Well, and I say, well, I do too. But tonight we're here to talk about sustainability. So we need to ask ourselves, is our dedication to single-family housing really making San Antonio more sustainable? For one, our current approach is not delivering nearly enough affordable housing. About 1/3 of the households in our city spend more than 30% of their household income on their home, on their mortgage. So that means they're house poor. And the situation isn't improving because we're only delivering 500 affordable housing units every year. So we're not keeping up. There's also an equity issue here because 99% of the federal tax benefits for home mortgage interest deductions go to households making more than $100,000 a year. 60% go to households making more than $200,000 a year. So I ask you, is this subsidy really a good way for middle and working class households to sustain and build wealth? Now, other cities are already challenging the allegiance to the single-family home. Minneapolis, for example, has done away with single-family zoning altogether. This means that multifamily housing can be built anywhere at any time. This might not make all the neighbors happy, but it will very likely accelerate housing supply, including affordable units. So when San Antonio is sustainable, it will find a way to reinvest the massive subsidies for single-family housing into a strategy that delivers a more diverse housing stock and spreads around the wealth. Okay, the final topic tonight is data. A sustainable San Antonio will decide that urban science is not a substitute for urban values. And I'd like to take this opportunity to discuss the opportunities and constraints of urban science and specifically the smart city, which, by the way, I'm a great supporter of, and I happen to work with these ideas. Okay, urban science is just what it sounds like. It's a transdisciplinary field that seeks knowledge of how cities work. The term smart cities is a little more specific. It refers to the application of data and technology to physical infrastructures like buildings and like roads. So in other words, smart cities, they try to make these physical systems smart. Now here you see a drawing from the Audi Urban Futures Project, which according to Audi will use technology to help, quote, develop products and solutions that make mobility in cities attractive again. And it's an incredible project, and it's advanced by some of the best designers in the world. But still, I can't help thinking back again to Chicago in the year 1909, when in response to traffic jams in the early automotive era, we invented the modern roadway. And it was a good idea in theory, to make a road that could accommodate pedestrians and transit and automobiles. In fact, this effort represented an early attempt at urban science, because it put technology at the service of the city. But still, 100 years later, the whole equation is turned upside down, because we live in a city now that's built to serve the technology of the automobile, rather than vice versa. And for me, this is a reminder that technology alone will not make the city sustainable. In other words, we cannot invent our way out of this. The city is the most complex artifact that human beings create. The way that a city looks, or its form, represents the totality of our aspirations. It's not just starting by saying that if we want to save our planet, we have to fix our city. And I'll conclude by saying that if we want to fix our city, we must examine our aspirations. Because true sustainability is not a question of form or of technology. It's a question of values. Now, speaking of values, as I put together this talk, I had the opportunity to discuss and debate urban values with some fantastic colleagues here at UTSA. The complexity of the city, as you know, is too much for any one discipline to know. So that's why I was very fortunate to draw on the expertise and talents of our academic community. And for that, I thank my colleagues. And as you leave here this evening, I urge you to do the same thing with your friends and colleagues. That is to re-examine your own values about the future of San Antonio. Because if you want to live sustainably, if we want to live sustainably, we need to redesign our relationship with the city, with the environment, and with each other. And when that important work is done, we'll know what a sustainable San Antonio will look like. Thank you.